Well, thanks for joining me. This is Good Grazing Makes Sense. And before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, United States Forest Service, and NRCS. Today, we're talking with Dallas Mount at Good Grazing Makes Sense. And ranching for profit, I would say, is wildly popular right now. Dallas, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe some kind of high level what ranch management consulting does?
I live in Wheatland, Wyoming. We've got a small grazing operation here that I run with some help from some summer help. But my main gig is I'm the head of ranch management consultants. We are a company that helps teach people in agriculture the business side of running their operation. Our most probably the most popular thing is our Ranching for Profit school. Ranching for Profit is a 7-day business management school for people that are in ag. We put about 14 of those on a year. Our main thing is helping farmers and ranchers learn the business side of farming and ranching, and whether it's looking at their economics, doing their finances. We do talk about grazing and ecology in the school quite a bit because that's a huge lever to push to get the businesses working well. Um, Most of the things that we do in Ranching for Profit, we've learned from ranchers that have participated in the program. So it's very much rancher driven, rancher led, but we just get to deliver it.
So that's a great intro on what ranching for profit is and what RMC does. I think maybe equally as important as what ranching for profit isn't.
There's a perception out there that we're peddling a recipe for what ranchers should do. I think those folks that have been through the school, at least in the last decade or so, will understand that that's not what we're doing. I don't think every ranch should calve in May and June, right? I don't think. I think there are ranches that should make their own hay, right? Please don't sell all your equipment and fire all your employees, right? But that's kind of reputations that we get is people say, well, Ranching for Profit's that school that tells you to calve in June, fire all your employees, sell all your hay equipment, and don't make hay, And I think that what happens is, though, we do teach to principles, and we tell folks, hey, these are principles that work in every environment, even across country borders, and so how are you going to apply these principles in your business to get the outcomes that you want to get, right? And those outcomes can be very specific to what that individual wants to do. Maybe you're managing for a absentee owner and they want a place that they can come and enjoy that looks a certain way, right, when they show up, and that's the way it looks. Well, that same managing towards that is going to be very different from managing to a place that is just entirely profit driven and is all about bottom line, right? Because they're going to look very different. So yeah, we don't have a recipe to follow. If it were that easy, heck, I could just print recipe cards and be done with it. It doesn't work that way. Ranching's a lot more complicated than that.
So good grazing makes sense. The core of what we do is trying to find those good ecological practices that create economic value. And aside from the good ecological practices, just having a resilient ranch financial plan is important to weather any kind of ecological storm. But when we talk about these ecological practices, I just jump right into this conversation that always gets had is the brittle environment and that won't work here. Can you talk a little bit about that? These principles.
The principles that we teach, the grazing principles. First one is plan, monitor, manage. Right. So have a plan for what your grazing plan is going to be before the season even starts. Right. Now that plan isn't chiseled in stone like Moses did the tablets. Right. When that plan is made, it's done with the best information we have now. When the season starts unfolding, that plan is going to change, right? So monitor against that plan, right? Hey, we're getting ready to turn cattle into this pasture. Does it look like it's ready for cattle? And then manage is going to be making those adjustments along the way. So that's our first principle that we teach. And you're right; these principles apply in every environment. From 4-inch precip to 64-inch precip. These principles work. So the second one is about allowing the plant's appropriate recovery, and we struggled a bit when we came up with that word, right? Because it is vague. It's hard to nail down. But I think that is anybody that's been grazing for very long, you after a few years, you start to, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? You start to figure out how little you actually know about these complicated ecosystems. So what at one point we believe is appropriate might be different from another point, might be different from another point. So it's a moving thing, but it's something you're asking the question of when you're going into pastures, have these plants had an opportunity to recover, right? Or am I feeling good about turning cattle in here? And so I think if we get that one right, we're, a lot of the things we're gonna start to build ecosystem health if we let those plants recover. So we can create a lot of sins in other things if we're allowing good recovery on our plants. The other principles are where it gets pretty interesting about how we apply these in different ecosystems. And they're about stock density, they're about length of graze period. And what I've found with working across a lot of these different environments is the infrastructure and the intensity which makes sense in one environment is going to be very different from the infrastructure and intensity which makes sense in another environment, right? So if I'm managing animals in a 60-inch precip zone, it very well might make sense to have, 6-hour graze periods in those things, right? Where cattle are on the move all the time, and we've got enough infrastructure there to get our stock densities, right? From, if you're going to use pounds, 100,000, 500,000 million pounds per acre kind of densities. Well, when we get out into desert type country, and unless somebody else is paying for that infrastructure, right? Unless we're not operating with inside economic realities, it probably doesn't make sense to put the kind of infrastructure in place to allow us to operate at those densities, right? Would that create land health? I think it would, right? Would it drive succession in a positive direction? I think it would, but we're operating inside of an economic reality, so we have to look at that and say, okay, what economically makes sense? What makes sense from how I want to live, what I want to do with myself from a day-to-day basis, and balance all those things when we're making those decisions. So the last principle to talk about here is just matching carrying capacity and stocking rate, right? And that one just makes sense. So let's match supply and demand. And we're going to be shifting that seasonally. We're going to be shifting that annually. We might be shifting that over 3 and 5 year periods in some environments. So just being aware of what kind of demand are we putting on the range versus what it's giving out of us, and being responsive to that. So those are the principles we teach from a grazing perspective. And I think we can step back and have some great arguments and discussions about practices and how the practices are applied, right? And you're going to be right half the time, and you might be wrong maybe a third of the time. You'd be wrong, right? But when we start talking about principles, I really have a hard time saying that those principles don't apply, and really just think about them. They're common sense, right? Let's make a plan. Let's let the plants recover. Let's match supply and demand. Okay. Now, how we apply those principles, we can have discussions about that till we're blue in the face.
So 2 things came out of that for me. One, can you tie that back to ranching economics? And 2, how do we tie those in on a federal grazing system where we really don't have the flexibility to pull a lot of that stuff off?
I'm going to take number 1 because that's the easier one first. How do we tie that back into economics? So when we teach economics, so from a ranching perspective, we talk about gross margin, and gross margin is what's the value we create. So let's take a cow. Okay, what's the value this cow creates? Right. So we're going to have hopefully she's going to wean a calf. What's that calf worth? We've got coal income. So anyway, we do through a scenario or through a series of transactions where we create the gross product, the value that cow creates. You can think of it as her gross income, although it's a little bit different. So what's the value she creates minus the direct cost to run her? Okay, direct costs are going to be those things that change proportionally as the units increase. Things like her vet cost, her fed feed cost, marketing expenses, trucking expenses, AI costs, if those are in there. So we take her gross product, the value she creates, minus those direct costs, and that money left over is the gross margin. Okay, it's completely irrelevant for us to talk about things like weaning weights, because weaning weights really have no correlation on profitability. Right. So we need to get past talking about that kind of stuff. Preg rates are another one. I mean, preg rates are related to profitability, but some of the ranches with the highest preg rates are the least profitable. Okay. So it's another one to kind of push aside. Let's stop talking about the production metrics. Let's talk about the profitability metrics. So
Can you expand on that a little bit? So you said something pretty big.
Okay.
Oh no, just throwing weaning weights and conception out the window. I think that's
Yeah.
worth talking about more.
Yeah. Let me tell you a story about that, and I think it'll come out in that. So, when I was working for the University of Wyoming, one of the things that I took upon myself was creating a database of all the producers that shared their economics with me over the years I was there. And once we had a pretty good group in that data set, then we started to put them together and do analysis on that data set. And as an animal science major, what kind of things was I interested in? I was interested in a lot of the cow production metrics, right? Conception rates, weaning rates, pounds weaned, all those kind of things. So when we had that data set, we looked at, well, what's a really good productivity of this cow herd? And when you get right down to it, the best one to use is pounds weaned per female exposed. Okay, so that takes into account cows that those cows you expose, those that don't get bred, those that don't wean a live calf, and then the size of the calf, right? So it's kind of all those production metrics pushed together. Pounds weaned per female exposed. So I had this data set. I had all these ranches' profitability numbers, and I had all their production numbers. When I looked at this data set as an animal science major, what do you think I expected to find? I expected to find that the more productive ranches were going to be among the more profitable. Okay. Well, when I actually looked into the data, what did we find? We found there was no relationship. There was the statistic nerds in here would appreciate there was no R squared, right? There was no relationship between productivity and profitability in that data set. And I've looked at several other states that do this as well. There's some large ones out of Kansas, North Dakota, things like that do these as well. And the trend is pretty common. Here's what I can draw from that. The most productive ranches are never the most profitable. Okay? And oftentimes we find the ranches with moderate to even low productivity numbers are among the most profitable. So this idea that productivity and profitability are correlated in ranching, especially in cow calf, we can throw that out the window, right? Now I'm a realist, right? There's a base level of productivity that has to happen, right? If you're coming in with 30% conception in your cows, I'm not going to expect you to, knock it out of the park. But once we meet that base level of productivity, more is not necessarily better, right? More conception, more pounds of calf, all these kind of things. Because what we start doing is we chase more without regard to cost. So a lot of these ranches are being run in the productivity paradigm, right? If I can just get more productive, I'll make more money. And that doesn't hold up. Okay, we were talking about gross margin. Okay, and the reason I was backing into that is because when we look at grazing and getting good at grazing and infrastructure development, I think one of the things that's often overlooked is bringing gross margin back into that decision matrix. So I'll talk to some people who maybe they went to a class about grazing or soil health, right? And they come home and they're like, "Hey, we're so fired up. We learned about this soil health stuff. We learned about this grazing. We're going to get really good at our grazing, and we're going to increase our carrying capacity by you fill in the blank, right? 20%, 30%, 40%, whatever they think they can do." And I'll say, "Oh, okay, great. That's awesome. I'm glad you're excited about that. So what's the gross margin on your cows?" Right? We're going to increase an enterprise. My question is, how's that enterprise working economically? Right? And sometimes they look at me with kind of a, well, what do you mean? And what I'd like to tell folks is when they get excited about grazing and about infrastructure development, about creating capacity, let's make sure we're expanding an enterprise that's good. Okay. So if we looked into somebody's gross margin and, oh, well, hey, look, it's negative $100, like you just said, we're going to run 100 more, right? That's not a very good thing to do, right? So we want to make sure the gross margin on the enterprise that we're expanding is solid before we go and do it. So that's one of the ways we use economics to help make grazing decisions.
So I'm going to come back to how do we implement this stuff in a rigid system of federal grazing.
There's been some stuff that's gotten me a bit more excited, and some of it's the outcome-based grazing stuff, right? If we can start getting some of the management protocols under which we're operating to think a bit more sensibly, and instead of prescribing methods, to start prescribing the outcome that we want, right? And then allow the person that's operating it some autonomy into doing the methods. I think that's a great way to look at it. Another way I think that we've seen some of our public land operators do is to really start getting creative about thinking, okay, what are the boundaries in which I'm operating, and then start to really challenge those. Right? Let's write them down. Okay, this is the rules of the game as I understand it within the boundaries that I'm operating. And then let's challenge those and make sure they're real. And once we've identified which ones are real, now we start thinking about, okay, how can we be creative about operating within this system, right? And so let me give you an example of that. Oftentimes I hear that we've got a public grazing, allotment permit, whatever you might have, and it specifies that we turn in this date, we turn out that date. This is the way the ownership of the animals will be handled. So that's locked me into only doing cow calf, and all I can do is they have to be my cows. And now I've got to feed them hay for 7 months in the wintertime, and I'm a victim of my circumstance, right? And that's the way it's presented to me without the last statement, right? But that's the way that they're sounding is, gee, I really like all this stuff you're talking about, but poor me, I'm a victim of my circumstance because I'm operating within these rules. Well, really, let's get the rules of the game out there. Okay, so if we've got a turnout date of, let's say, June 1st, and we've got a come off date of, let's say, the 1st of December, whatever it might be, and this is what we know we're up against, and this is the way the animals have to be branded. All right, what kind of animals can we run that meet all those criteria that have a really strong gross margin? Okay, now let's get creative. And I bet if we thought about that for 15 minutes, we could come up with a list of 7 or 8 different enterprises that we could throw on the wall, right? So that's what I mean by understand, chalk the field, right? What are the rules of the game? Let's get it laid out there. And now that we've got the field chalked, let's start thinking about, okay, what are our options within this? And maybe the bigger underlying message there is shedding this paradigm of victimhood. Okay, it's so easy to wrap ourselves in this cloak of, oh, poor me, these are the things that I'm struggling with, right? That kind of stuff is just going to pull you down. So put that aside. Okay, here's the cards I've been dealt. This is what I've got at my disposal. What can we do? What works and what could be cool with these resources that we have?
So I was driving around today doing some monitoring, and this question came up to me. You can clearly ranch in an ecosystem that's not ecologically thriving. So what's the benefit to people who to change how they do things and create a thriving ecosystem? There's some low hanging fruit there for sure, but if a ranch has been doing it for 100 years in a declining ecosystem, is there incentive to change it?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I want to I want to throw it back to you after I'm done with it and have you chime in too, because I'd like to hear your answer to that. Here's where my mind went when you asked that question. If I had a room full of ranchers and I said, what's the biggest problem in agriculture today? Now, first of all, picture what this group is going to look like that are sitting there at a national meeting of like a cattlemen's group. What if they took off their hats? What are their heads going to look like? Right? They're either going to be bald or like mine, gray. And so they're probably all 60s and 70s. And if we ask them what's the biggest problem in agriculture today, they're probably going to say, well, our kids don't want to come back. Nobody wants to be a part of it. Nobody wants to work hard, right? They're going to talk about succession and things related to that. To me, that might be one of the answers to that is, well, if nobody wants to be a part of this awesome business, maybe it's because we make these things too physically demanding to run them. They're too capital intensive. Okay, they're not economically profitable, and we're watching our land degrade underneath of our feet for some of us, right? Where other people are ranching in ways that balance work and life better, that are creating businesses that are more economically profitable, have found ways to do it without enormous capital investments needing to be required, and they're building ecosystem health at the same time, right? If you were a chomping at the bit, thriving 20-something, 30-something, which business would you be excited to go join? So to me, that's part of the answer is how do we make these businesses attractive to the next generation?
You answered a lot of my questions. Is there anything you want to talk about to our audience?
So I spent 17 years working with University of Wyoming, and I think there was a perception of in academia, especially, I got this of like us and them, right? Us and academia and the ranchers out there on the ground. And when you run in the academia circles, we started to feel like we had the answers, right? And we were on the cutting edge, and we were kind of leading it. And what can we do to help the ranchers and put this information out there in a way that they can understand, so they can follow it? And I guess I would say to my colleagues in academia, who are some brilliant people who I have a lot of respect for, uh, there's a lot of ranchers out there that are decades ahead of where academia is from a thought leadership perspective. So I want to encourage those folks in academia to be really intentional about finding those people who are leading, who are thought leaders out there in the ranching world, and link up with them, and they're going to pull you so much further ahead than just staying within that ivory tower and talking into ourselves in that own circle. So that would be maybe my challenge to those who are in that area, is to look out there and find those people and really start learning from them, because I think it would help our organizations all come along further together.
I've heard somebody else say it, but I did not get into this business because I liked hanging out with people. And it turns out that's a very important part of this whole thing, is those relationships and building them.
Yeah.
Well, Dallas, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. Can you tell people where to find Ranching for Profit?
Sure. Yeah. If you'd like to check us out, just go on ranchingforprofit.com, ranchmanagement.com. There's a list of our schools, what we're doing. We're going to have a school somewhere not too far from you in the next year. And if it is far from you, get over it, get on a plane, come join us. One of the benefits of the school is the diversity of people that we get. So it's great to have, ranchers and non-ranchers there. If you're sitting at a table with 6 cow-calf producers, it's going to be a pretty mediocre discussion, right? If we've got a table of 4 ranchers, one person that's selling direct that maybe lives in Vermont, and a rancher in Nevada and a rancher in Colorado and an agency person, that's going to be a really rich discussion. So we'd love to have folks come to the school if it's a good fit.
Great. Well, thanks again, Dallas, and thanks to our sponsors, the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, and NRCS.